They did not put any sugar in this. This might be the worst day of my life. Yeah, I don't have a lot going on. What's going on, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome to a Tech Wave video where we are going to dive into the Super Nintendo, one of my favorite consoles ever. This was, I think, the best system at the time. Sales tend to agree with me as well for this versus the Genesis, and this is a system that I loved growing up. This was like my system back then. The 64 was okay. This had the library, it had the third-party support. It was like the de facto 16-bit system. I think a lot of people agree with me because I think a lot of people also grew up with it, especially if you're around my age, and this was great. So let's take a look at the Super Nintendo. First off, I always get a lot of weird comparison questions for this, so we're going to run through a few real quick. Here's the Super Nintendo compared to the Super Nintendo Classic. Much smaller. Makes sense. Here is the Super Nintendo versus the Nintendo Classic. Much smaller. Makes sense. Here's the B250 PC Mate with motherboard actually still in it, surprisingly, compared to the Super Nintendo. How about this? Let's see. How does the Nintendo Switch stack up to the Super Nintendo? Oh, you're the boss. Super Nintendo stacks better. All right, now that all that ridiculousness is out of the way, let's actually take this apart, and I want to talk about it a bit while we're taking it apart and everything. So hopefully this camera angle works out well enough. I have another camera coming so we can get like a top-down view, I guess. We'll see how that goes, but you should be able to see everything pretty well. So on the back, it does require a specific driver to get that out. That's their game bit driver. You need it for their games, and you need it for their systems like the Super Nintendo, the Nintendo 64, the GameCube, and then they stopped and switched to a tri-wing driver for the Wii and the Wii U. This does become Philips inside as well. The game bit, though, was interesting because it was harder to get around here. Usually you had to order it online, and at that time it was very difficult to get everything because these are screwdrivers you don't usually walk into a store and find, like a Lowe's or anything. So let's take this apart here and get into it. See, back then, this was the early 90s where things were a little different. See, the Genesis came out actually quite a bit early compared to this because Sega wanted to go up against the Nintendo to try to get an early start because the Genesis was way more capable than the original Nintendo, if you remember that. But games like Super Mario 3, Mario 3 still outsold a lot of stuff on the Genesis just because it was such an outstanding game. But back then, it was very different when it comes to, I guess, political correctness or being nice to your competitor. They were downright taking shots at each other constantly. For example, you guys probably remember blast processing. That was a big deal back then, because people would always talk about blast processing, and not a lot of people actually knew what it meant. Even now, I don't think a lot of people know what they were technically talking about when it came to blast processing. Now, you saw those blast processing advertisements everywhere.
The Sega Genesis has blast processing. Super Nintendo doesn't. So what's blast processing do?
And a lot of people looked at it and said, okay, that's blast processing, and that means that the CPU was clocked higher, which it was. It was clocked higher. The Super Nintendo's CPU was clocked lower. Actually, the Super Nintendo one was actually variable and would change, and depending on the cartridge you had in. See, you had low ROMs and high ROMs, and they would require different clock speeds. So the Super Nintendo was actually set up to change its clock speed. I believe it topped out somewhere around 5.5 megahertz, whereas the Genesis was above 7 megahertz. Doesn't sound like a big deal now. Back then it kind of was. So a lot of people figured that. That's technically not what blast processing is talking about. It was just kind of a term that was thrown around, and that's pretty much what people thought that it meant. Sorry, I did get a lot of dust out of it. It was very dusty, this one. I actually picked it up at a recent flea market, like a month ago maybe. I don't know, whenever it started becoming warm out again is when I picked it up. Like one of the first flea markets that happened this year. Anyway, blast processing. So they first started using it, I remember specifically, because I would even use it to argue because console wars were worse back then than they are now because the companies would kind of encourage them. So I remember it was the Sega Genesis launch of Sonic 2, where Sega themselves made a big push with it, where they had commercials and magazines and blast processing, and Sonic runs super fast because Sega can do blast processing. And a lot of people, again, attribute that to the CPU, when in actuality, you can go online and even look this up now, the origins and everything. Sega originally coined the term to refer to the high-speed bandwidth and fill rate of the Mega Drive VDP graphics processor. And it technically was a reference to how the DMA controller could blast data into the VDP graphics processor and DAC at high speeds. Again, though, most people kind of attribute it to the speed of the CPU. Now, the Super Nintendo was technically much more capable, and we're going to talk about that a bit here as well. The reason the Super Nintendo was more capable specifically came down to essentially its graphics processor, its PPU, if you will. And a lot of that had to do with how many colors it could put on screen. See, now we talk about polygon counts and textures and anti-aliasing and all this stuff. Back then we were working with obviously sprites, and the idea was to try to get more depth out of the picture by using shaders of different colors and things like that. See, the Super Nintendo had an extreme advantage with that. Its color palette was a significant amount more than the Genesis. I mean, like, significant. Like, the Genesis had a color palette, which of course are colors you can choose from, of about 512. The Super Nintendo had a color palette of over 32,000. Yeah, 32,000. For example, there are a lot of sites out there. I'll actually link you guys to one in the description if you want to read more about the differences between the two, because they have it well documented. But you can look at something like a Toy Story, for example. A great screenshot on the site. And that you can see the difference clearly, right? You can see the shaders between the two. The Genesis is very flat looking, whereas if you look at, say, the Super Nintendo, it's shaded and it looks like it pops off the screen a bit more. I even think something like Super Mario World, very colorful, right? Even the visuals in something like Donkey Kong Country, which was amazing at the time, came down to using pre-rendered sprites and everything, and using the color schemes and stuff that they had that seemed to be only able to be done on the Super Nintendo, not really the Genesis. So that's why you might look at it and say, wow, that actually looks a lot better on the Super Nintendo for some of these games. I don't know why. It came down to color palette and the ability to also display a lot more colors on screen. The Genesis was like 61, and the Super Nintendo was like 200 to 225. So there's a lot of differences, and colors really help those sprites and just the backgrounds and everything pop off the screen. So that was really one of the biggest differences there. Let's get this. All right, now I'm going to unscroll this stuff and we're going to take a look at the board. One thing I liked about the Super Nintendo is the power button. This guy flips on and off, is actually wired, so it actually unplugs. Now, these wouldn't get damaged too often, but sometimes you get some junk in there, like, you know, we're kids, we spill stuff into it and eat popsicles and touch it or something. I trust me, I saw this when I worked at the store, and I actually worked on more Super Nintendos than you would think, because there's a fuse in here right next to this, actually, that would always go bad, so you would replace that. But I also saw a lot of stuck power buttons, the switches, and I ended up just replacing them. They pop off like this, and you just plug it in, 2 screws, and you're back in business. It was pretty nice to have it that way rather than have it soldered to the board. That's the biggest pain, is when it's soldered to the board. So, even the controller ports on the front are also modular, which is really nice. A lot of the stuff in here, believe it or not, is modular, including the cartridge slot, which I can actually rip right off of here. This thing is a pain, by the way, to play around with. Just keep it all together. It has a loaded spring to keep this guy. This is our eject button that would kick the cartridges out, you know, so you didn't have to rip them out, it would pop them up. But the spring is all loaded and everything, so you gotta kind of be careful with that. That was always a pain to work with when these would come apart. And the cartridge slots were very interesting because, like I said, they actually come right off. Let me get this last screw out and you'll see what I mean. You could technically replace the cartridge slots in these fairly easily, mostly because they just pop right off like this. You could technically even clean them, I guess. If you have an ultrasonic cleaner, I would throw these in occasionally to our ultrasonic cleaner, and it would work fairly well to clean them. But you can actually order, I believe, new ones of these and pop them on. At least I did back then when these would stop working. Specifically, the pins on the outside would stop working, and if you had games like Star Fox, for example, that use the enhancement chip with the Super FX, or the Mario chip, I guess you want to call it, and the outer pins would stop working, so it wouldn't read those, but it would read the other games that did not use those outer pins. Again, Mario RPG is another good one. It would stop doing that. You replace it, and boom, you're in business, and it literally just pops off. Again, modular. So much better. The Nintendo Entertainment System kind of had the same thing, but the top-loading aspect of the Super Nintendo system was much better, right? That's why a lot of people like the top-loading NES, but then they have to get it like modded with, you know, RGB or AV or anything like that, because it didn't support it. Very weird move by Nintendo, by the way, to do that. So let's get this guy off, and we should have access to the motherboard itself, and we can take a look at some of the chips. All right, we got all the screws and everything out, and let's take a look. There's some more dust on this thing. Let's take a look around the board here. Ah! Okay, I hit it. It's still moving around. No, it's not a bug. It's a Sony sound chip. That's right. There's a Sony sound chip. That's actually who produced the chip for the Super Nintendo. That's, of course, before they, you know, had all of their issues with Nintendo, where Nintendo pulled out at the last minute because they realized they probably wouldn't make a lot of money if Sony worked with them on building a CD unit for the Super Nintendo. But, of course, we had that prototype that was really cool to see, and that got out there. But yes, this is the Sony SSMP, Nintendo and Sony on the same chip. Kind of weird now to think about, right? This is a 240C38E, and this is the audio processing unit of the Super Nintendo. It's there's an 8-bit chip, and then there's also a 16-bit DSP chip right below that with 64 kilobytes of SRAM. And it's interesting because this was another big advantage, having this sound chip. As you might recall, a lot of the stuff sounded better on the Super Nintendo, at least to a lot of people. The Genesis had more of, like, I guess, kind of a bass line to it almost, right? Whereas Super Nintendo, a lot of people would hear some really nice audio with things like Final Fantasy. And, well, there you go. A good audio processing chip from Sony really helped along the Super Nintendo when it came to that. We also have our 2 PPUs, or the picture processing units there. Again, 2 and then 1. Those, of course, work to draw everything on screen for you, produce those colors. Below that, the CPU for the Nintendo, and you can see SCPU A5A2202. This was variable. It would change back and forth depending on how much they actually needed in terms of megahertz compared to the cartridge that was actually in there. And then you also have your RAM. This system had 128 kilobytes of RAM, and that, of course, helped the system along. Now, what's really interesting about this is the system did technically have a heatsink. Interesting, right? No moving parts or anything, no fan was needed, and technically this heatsink is not actually for the CPU or the PPU or even the sound chip or anything. No, this is a little different. The reason they had this was for one chip in particular that you're seeing here, the AN7805. Now, the idea of the 7805 is it would change voltage that would come in, essentially a voltage regulator, and it needed a place to put any extra energy that would be turned into heat, and it used the heatsink for that. Now, this isn't fancy or new. In fact, this is one of the few off-the-shelf components that the Super Nintendo did use. Now, I do know there was 7805, I believe, in the original Nintendo as well. Same deal. It would just regulate power, and anything that was left over would be turned into heat and then displaced onto this heatsink. It wasn't enough to need a fan, but it was still interesting that out of everything that needed heatsink in this system, it was not the CPU, not the GPU or anything like that. It was the voltage regulator that sits there. Lastly, I kind of wish that they had made the reset switch its own thing as well, much like the power button, because there are times where this reset switch will have issue. I saw that as well, and it's almost like it's always being held down, and you actually have to remove the reset switch. I believe you can also disable it, but you'd actually have to remove it. It's technically through-hole mounted, but it was a real pain, whereas this was a plug. And then one of the other frustrating things, you may have noticed this before, depending on your experiences with getting these secondhand, as you pretty much have to now. The back has the power port on there, and it's this little cone-shaped piece of plastic. Those would break off a lot, actually. Seriously, I would see them, probably 1 in every 3 that I would see that would come into the store would have that issue. You can get these brand new, and I would end up replacing a lot of them, also through hole, and you have to be very careful when you take it off. You gotta kind of work it around. That was a little annoying. I kind of wish that was like maybe steel on the inside, right? On that little circle, or aluminum or something, just to be a little, I guess a little more stable, because once that breaks off, you just have like 2 little pins in there that are kind of free floating. I mean, when I look at it, it's a very thick board, it's a sturdy board. They did a great job building it and making even a top loader kind of, like I said, modular, which was nice. Power button's modular. That's spring loaded, which was really annoying. Everything else, though, was pretty good. I liked that the controller port also modular. They didn't really break that often, but in case one stopped working, you could technically order that separately. And really, it's an easy system to take apart once you get the hang of it. The screws inside are all Phillips. It's just getting into it is annoying because of the game bits. But I like the system. You can also do all kinds of cool mods with RGB and everything to get the best possible picture out of it. And really, looking back on it, this system was great. This is one of the best, I think, 2D platforms ever, I think personally. Things like Mario, even the top-down ones with Final Fantasy. This system had a massive library. It had probably the best third-party support Nintendo's had since this system. Seriously, once they went to the Nintendo 64, it was kind of all downhill with third parties and everything, and PlayStation came in, offered the better options for it, and the rest is history. But I still hold up that this is one of the best systems of all time, especially in my book, because of my personal history with it. But let me know what you guys think about the Super Nintendo. Did anything in here surprise you? Maybe the Sony chip did. I don't know. I'm curious. Let me know what you guys think. Make sure you guys like the video if you enjoyed it. Dislike it if not. And let me know what your favorite Nintendo system is, or non-Nintendo system, around this time. In the 16-bit, 8-bit era, maybe you liked the handheld systems. I'm very curious. But thanks, guys, for watching, and I'll see you next time.